Hi, gang. Hello, hello, hello. Here comes your Thursday poll question at Smerconish.com. Were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? I'm giving you three choices today. Normally I do a binary, but today I felt obligated to go with an unsure option as well. More on that in just a moment. Thank you to my friends at Parks Casino in Shippensburg, where you can get lucky in no time. Located just off exit 29 of Route 81, 45 minutes from the state capitol in Harrisburg. Parks Casino, my casino of choice. Parks Casino Shippensburg, so close. If you're in Hagerstown or Martinsburg or the nearby Pennsylvania towns of Chambersburg, Carlisle, and Greencastle. Every Monday, they celebrate our veterans. That's a nice thing. You show your military ID and you'll get a free hot dog lunch with chips and a soda as a thank you from Parks Casino. And then every Tuesday, it's the Parks Casino 50% golden discount. The summer comedy series continues on Friday, the 15th, so a week from tomorrow, with Chris Johnson from the Impractical Jokers comedy tour. That sounds like a lot of fun. Take my recommendation and check out all the action, the entertainment, and the excitement that they have to offer. It's a smoke-free environment with 500 state-of-the-art slot machines, 48 live dealer electronic table games featuring blackjack and roulette, plus a great daily happy hour. As I like to say, it's always 5 o'clock at the Parks Casino in Shippensburg. Get in on all the action. Parks Casino Shippensburg off Interstate 81. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. So yesterday, I'm okay with this. I said yesterday, I'll be fine if there are fewer votes because I recognize that the Wednesday poll question was pretty demanding of all of you. Do you live in a gerrymandered legislative district? Do you know what district you live in, whether we're talking congressional district or state assembly or state senate? But of course, because of the events in Texas and the ripple effects of what's going on in Texas, I thought it appropriate and to follow the conversations that we've had here recently with Mark Halpern, with David Wasserman from Cook Political Report, with David Davey, who was a great guest yesterday, who wrote really the original book on this subject, Rat Blanked. I wanted to do something with a gerrymandered theme, and it caused me, as I was following Texas, to pull up the map of my own congressional district, my own state legislative district, my own state senate district, and to look at the contours of the map, which is not entirely telling, but often an indicator of gerrymandering. And I thought I would ask, okay, how many of you live in a gerrymandered district? 25,765 voted yesterday. 63.42% said no. 36.58% said yes. So roughly 2/3 say no, doesn't apply to me. I thought it was also just a healthy exercise to cause everybody to think about whether they know who their representatives are and in what districts they reside. Okay, relative to today's poll question, and bear with me because I want to read to you a little bit. I'm asking, were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? 80 years ago, yesterday was Hiroshima, and 80 years ago, Saturday, 2 days from now, will be Nagasaki. And of course, the Japanese surrender came within days of those two bombings, and forever people will debate whether it was all justified. Yesterday on the program, two great guests in the same hour, the third hour of the program. We had Professor Julian Zelizer, who's a historian from Princeton. He had just published a piece for Foreign Policy, The Hiroshima Exhibition the World Wasn't Allowed to See. And the whole piece was all about how there was a debate in the mid-90s around a 1995 exhibit planned at Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum about the Enola Gay. The Enola Gay, which was, the plane piloted by Colonel Tibbets that dropped the bomb that hit in Hiroshima. And it was really interesting to talk to Professor Zelizer just about how they couldn't get everybody on the same page in the mid-90s about how to recognize the events of Hiroshima and the Enola Gay. So what did they do in the end? They simply displayed the aircraft without any of the description, without any of the background that had been contemplated. His appearance on my program yesterday followed that of Garrett Graff. Garrett Graff, if you're watching me on YouTube, who assembled this tome, which is titled The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb. Garrett Graff has really found his niche because he painstakingly and in chronological order pulls together the accounts of the people who mattered most, in this instance, more than 500 individuals involved in the creation of the weapon, the dropping of the weapon, and the aftermath of what transpired 80 years ago yesterday and Saturday. So he just published this book, and he was a great guest, and I appreciated having him here. And I read from different passages on air yesterday, but he referenced something in the interview that caused me to go back and reread, and I thought I'd share with you because it's relevant to the poll question. Were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? Your choices are yes, no, and unsure. And on air yesterday, after I had asked him, actually, I'd read aloud the recounting of those who were on the Enola Gay of exactly what happened when they dropped that bomb and what they saw. And then Garrett Graff said, you know, it's really like a tale of two cities. That's not his word choice, mine. In terms of how they were then greeted when they got back to base versus the death and destruction that the Japanese were dealing with in Hiroshima. Here, I'll just share this with you. Major Charles W. Sweeney, quote, a picture-perfect mission from beginning to end. Luis Alvarez, I used the time. This is now on the way back to base after the dropping of the bomb. I used the time to write a long letter to my 4-year-old son, Walt, for him to read when he was older. I was thinking about the consequence of the bombing I had just witnessed. Quote, the days of large bombing raids with several hundred planes are finished. A single plane disguised as a friendly transport can now wipe out an entire city. That means to me, all nations will have to get along in a friendly fashion or suffer the consequences of a sudden sneak attack, which can cripple them overnight. There's more to that, but then from Colonel Paul Tibbets. It was 2:58 p.m. when we touched down on the long runway from which we had taken off with such apparent effort 12 hours before. Major Sweeney, while we made our final approach to Northfield, Colonel Tibbets had already landed and was taxiing in. As I touched down on runway B, I saw a throng of people who had massed in the area near Tibbets' hard stand. The hundreds of cheering men was a sight to behold. As we rolled down the taxiway past Tibbets' airplane, it was clear there was a full-scale celebration underway. From Colonel Tibbets, if I had given it any thought, I would have known that our arrival would be an occasion for some sort of ceremony, although I managed quickly to palm the pipe I was smoking. I was hardly ready for the formality of the occasion, but no one seemed to mind. One after another shook my hands, slapped my back, jubilant over the success of our mission, and wanting to hear more about the bomb and the destruction it had caused. Silver stars were later presented to other members of my crew and to the crewmen from the other planes that took part in the mission. Sergeant Paul Metro, as the Enola Gay was homeward bound, we on Tinian were celebrating the end of the war. We felt sure Japan would surrender. There was a double ration of free beer and Coke and a flatbed truck with a band where guys could jitterbug with one another since there were no women around. There were pie eating and egg tossing contests. Another contest was a three-man race in which the legs of the center man facing backwards were tied to the legs of the outside man. So you get the feel on the American side of the ledger. Now, the later hours of August 6th in Hiroshima found the city devastated and beyond recognition. Fires continued everywhere. Refugees and victims began the long quest to find missing family members, searching what used to be familiar neighborhoods now turned into scenes from Dante, and struggled to escape the burning carnage, usually on foot. Organized rescue missions were small and few. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Rivers were clogged with bodies. Most burned beyond recognition. Only with time would rescue crews realize that due to differences in body buoyancy, women floated face up while male corpses floated face down. And then there's an in-person account, Kenshi Hirata, an accountant at the Mitsubishi Corp. First, I decided to search for my wife along the river. I went to the river and looked over the stone wall that goes down to the water. Then I started for the hospital. When I reached the hospital, I came upon a surprising and shocking scene. Numbers of people burned red and black were lying on the ground. Dead bodies were floating in the big pond in the center of the garden, which used to belong to Prince Asano. They must have jumped into the pond because of the unbearable heat. Some were dead with their hands clutching at the brink of the pond. Some were half sunken in the water. I could see that there were many more bodies sunk at the bottom of the pond. I walked from one corner of the garden to the other, looking at every woman who seemed to be about the age of my wife. I searched in that pond and in the trees, but I was unable to find her. As I made my way through the ranks of horribly burned people with their skin hanging in shreds, men, women, children, crawled toward me with their hands stretched out, asking for water, water. I am haunted by their dying countenances as I had to push away their hands and continue the search for my wife. Anyway, that gives you a picture of 80 years ago from different perspectives on this day. And so now to the question, to the poll question. I want to tell you something interesting. As I sometimes do, I'm mimicking someone else's poll question because Pew Research just asked this issue. And they found 80 years on the question of whether the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified. 35% said justified, 31% said not justified, 33% were unsure. A third, essentially. A third, and a third. Men are more likely than women to say that the bombings were justified. Those who are older, more likely, unsurprisingly, I think, to believe that the bombings were justified. There's a partisan divide. About half of Republicans and independents who lean toward the Republican Party, 51%, say the bombings were justified. Democrats and Democratic leaners more likely to say that the bombings were not justified. Here's the most interesting thing to me. The most interesting thing to me when Americans are asked, and by the way, a high percentage say that they've got a good degree of familiarity. If you're wondering and saying Americans are just not literate today and they don't even know what Hiroshima and Nagasaki were all about, the polls suggest that people believe they've got a pretty decent handle on what transpired. Most interesting to me is that in 1945, immediately after the bombings, a Gallup poll was conducted, face-to-face interviews, and 85% of Americans said justified. They approved. I pulled the Gallup survey, the Gallup data. Gallup asked the question in 1945, and then in 1990, and then in 91, 94, 95, 2005. And you see an erosion of the approval number. In Gallup's data through 2005, it never gets to a minority. It doesn't get to a third. But it gets as low as 57% by 2005. So in the immediate aftermath, 85% said justified. Now, here's a really interesting radio conversation starter. And I might do this today on air and take some calls on it. Are we better to trust the judgment? See, I have a reaction. My reaction is to say, I'm going with the people who lived through it. 85% at the time of Americans said it was justified. And I fully realize some people may say, well, their judgment was clouded. It was clouded by war. It was clouded by the events of 41 through 45. They were exhausted from the death and the destruction. 60 million people died worldwide, 15 of them combatants, 15 million, 45 million civilians. That's an amazing statistic. Are we better to trust their judgment or sort of in the calmness of the intervening 80 years. And what it brings to my mind is September 11. September 11, which was the Pearl Harbor of my life. Hopefully there won't be another one. And when I think about issues, and I've been directly affected by this because of some of my writings and because of some of my words, when I think of issues like harsh interrogation methods or profiling, and I think about where the country was post 9/11, i.e. me writing Flying Blind in the immediate aftermath, and where the country is today, I'm sure you'd see exactly the same thing. You would see a diminished level of support for harsh interrogation methods from where we were at the time and where we are right now. So who has the better judgment? The people who lived through it and were making their decisions in real time, or those of us who later pontificate? I think that's a great issue. In fact, I'm kind of working myself up to redoing today's intended radio program to directly go with that. But that's not the poll question. The poll question instead, you've just gotten the extended treatment here. The poll question asks, were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? And your options are to vote yes, no, or unsure. So have at it. Go to Smerconish.com right now and cast your ballot on that poll question. I love it. I hope you love it. And appreciate you for voting and listening and watching on YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, will you please like and subscribe and set yourself up for notifications? Okay. I appreciate all of you, and I thank you very, very much. See ya.